The first impact of the hydraulic breaker sent a sickening shudder through David Thorne's skeletal frame. He gripped the controls of the rented mini-excavator, feeling the jarring shock travel from the machine's chassis up through his arms. The noise, a deafening, rhythmic, clang-chug thump, was a primal scream in the otherwise manicured silence of the Hawthorne Ridge cul-de-sac. The pool had been a symbol of a dream that was now financially toxic. 3 years earlier, it had promised shimmering summer afternoons, laughter, and the perfect suburban life. Now it was a liability, a gaping maw that devoured insurance premiums and property value in a volatile market. David was selling the house, stripping away every non-essential luxury to make the balance sheet palatable. The pool had to go. He had started the demolition at dawn, before the August heat could truly settle in. The water, drained days ago, had left behind a calcified residue on the fiberglass, a stubborn, sickly green reminder of happier times he couldn't afford to keep. He tore through the deck first, the wood splintering and protesting with the sound of 1,000 broken promises. It was precisely 9:17 a.m. when Karen Albright made her first appearance. David recognized the precise, aggressive click of her bespoke Italian leather flats on the asphalt before he even saw her. He had been bracing for her, mentally preparing for the inevitability of the HOA president's righteous indignation. Karen's life seemed to be a series of escalating complaints, her sole mission to enforce a set of neighborhood bylaws she appeared to have memorized in utero. He cut the engine. The silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the panting of the excavation crew he'd hired. 2 lean men named Leo and Miguel, and the high, insistent chirping of a cardinal. Karen stood at the edge of his property line, hands locked behind her back like a general surveying a besieged enemy fortification. Her face, a mask of perpetual disappointed skepticism, was aimed directly at the cavernous, half-destroyed fiberglass shell. "Mr. Thorne," she announced, her voice pitched perfectly to carry across the front yard without sounding like a shout, a true Karen power move. "I need to understand what exactly is transpiring here." David wiped a thick band of sweat from his forehead with the back of a leather glove. "I'm removing the pool, Karen, as per the county permit I filed last week." "A pool," she countered, taking one purposeful step onto his lawn. Leo immediately tensed, ready to intervene. "An in-ground pool. You're not simply removing a feature. You are performing a major subterranean excavation and alteration of the landscape. And I find the timing deeply irregular. The timing is when I could afford the heavy equipment rentals," David said flatly. "It's a liability. I'm filling it in." Karen's eyes narrowed, not focusing on David, but on the deep gouge the breaker had just made in the pool's floor. "Fill it in? With what, exactly? Are you aware of the environmental regulations regarding backfill integrity? Is the fill material compacted and certified to prevent future subsidence? Furthermore, and I find this of particular concern, why the urgency? I don't need your permission, Karen. I need to sell this house. The pool is an anchor." He knew that was the surface-level truth. The deeper, colder truth was that he couldn't stand the sight of the water anymore. He needed the blue to be replaced by solid, unforgiving dirt. He needed the trauma, the very specific, defining trauma of the last year, to be buried under 20 tons of gravel and clay. Karen's lips thinned into a razor-sharp line. "That is a facile explanation, David. Pools don't just become anchors. They are highly desired assets. Something is wrong here. Your disposal contractor was here at 6 this morning. Why the extreme secrecy?" "It wasn't secrecy, it was 6 a.m., David snapped, the heat and the resentment finally breaking his composure. "I was trying to be quiet." "Quiet when dismantling a structure? That's preposterous. I believe you are concealing something." She reached into the pocket of her pristine white capri pants and produced her phone. It was large, encased in a durable, no-nonsense cover, and she activated the camera, pointing it squarely at the construction site. "Karen, don't," David warned. "I am documenting a potential bylaw violation and—" She paused dramatically, her eyes flicking up to meet his, bright with malicious certainty. "A major environmental disturbance. I will require full documentation of the entire process, including the composition of the backfill, the compaction schedule, and a signed affidavit from your contractor. I have already contacted the city zoning office." Leo, who had been listening silently, shook his head and muttered in Spanish. David took a deep, ragged breath. He couldn't afford to fight the HOA. He just needed to get the job done. "Fine," he conceded, cutting his engine back on. The roar was his only response. "Document all you want, Karen. Just stay off the active site." He plunged the breaker back down, the metallic shriek drowning out any possible retort. For the rest of the day, Karen was a persistent, silent sentinel. She moved from the property line to the edge of the street, then back behind her own manicured shrubbery, the flash of her phone camera occasionally catching the sunlight. She captured every scoop of debris, every splintered piece of lumber, and every time David's exhausted crew paused for water. David worked with a desperate fury. Every swing of the machine was a blow against his own misfortune. He wasn't just destroying a pool. He was destroying the last remnants of a past that had almost destroyed him. The physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the silent weight of his grief. By 4 p.m., the pool was unrecognizable, a shattered basin of sharp, ugly fragments. Leo was spraying down the dusty ground with a hose to manage the airborne particulate. That's when the real trouble started. Karen emerged again, this time marching with an almost military cadence. She wasn't carrying her phone. She carried an air of triumphant, chilling finality. She stopped short of the property line, but her gaze was not on the shattered fiberglass. It was on the deep, narrow trench Leo had dug alongside the pool to check for unexpected drainage pipes. A routine precaution. That trench. "David," she stated, her voice unnervingly calm. The kind of calm that precedes a Category 5 hurricane. "How deep is it?" "Deep enough to verify the plumbing, Karen. It's safe." "You filed for a pool removal," she continued, ignoring him. "Not a subsurface exploratory excavation of this magnitude, and look at the depth of the foundation. It's extraordinary." She was staring intently at a dark patch of earth near the bottom of the trench, a patch that looked denser, older. David felt a cold prickle of fear. The truth was, the pool was deeper than standard. He'd insisted on the custom depth 3 years ago. It was a deep-end custom build, Karen, nothing nefarious. "I see the soil disruption, David. It's not standard foundation material. It looks recently disturbed in a specific place. It looks like you didn't just remove the pool. It looks like you dug up the ground beneath the pool before you started breaking the concrete." The accusation was absurd, yet it landed like a punch. The exhaustion, the grief, and Karen's relentless aggression combined to push David over the edge. "Get off my property, Karen! I am working. You are harassing me. What the hell do you think I'm hiding? Jewels, contraband?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fatigue and anger. She took a single deliberate step back, planting her feet firmly on the curb. She held her chin high. "I don't know what you're hiding, David," she said, her voice now rising to a crescendo of public outrage. "But I have observed irregular construction practices, suspicious haste, uncertified excavation, and extreme emotional distress when questioned. And given the specific depth and the strange material visible in that trench, I have made a decision. I have just notified the police that a concerned neighbor has reported a possible undisclosed burial on your property." David froze. The mini-excavator's engine sputtered into a dying cough. Leo and Miguel stopped hosing down the debris. The cardinal stopped singing. "You did what?" David whispered, the word hollow and meaningless. "You heard me?" Karen replied, pulling her phone out again, but this time she was talking into it. "Yes, officer? I believe they are attempting to cover up the evidence right now. It is absolutely urgent." David stumbled off the machine's platform, the world tilting slightly. He started walking toward her, his gloves coming off, ready to scream the entire cul-de-sac awake. Before he could take 3 steps, the sound returned. Not the clang-chug of destruction, but the distinct, heavy-treaded approach of a police cruiser turning onto Hawthorne Ridge. The cruiser pulled up sharply behind Karen's Mercedes. 2 uniformed officers, a young woman and an older man with the weary look of someone who had seen it all, stepped out. They approached the perimeter tape David had strung up. the older officer. Sergeant Reynolds looked from the shattered, dusty chaos of the pool to the perfectly composed, indignant figure of Karen, and then to David, who looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. "Ma'am, you called this in as an undisclosed burial site?" Reynolds asked Karen, his tone perfectly neutral. "Sergeant, yes," Karen insisted, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at David. "He's destroying evidence. Look at the foundation of that pit. It's 3 feet deeper than a normal pool would require. And the urgency! He's been trying to bury something significant since 6 a.m. Reynolds turned his tired eyes to David. "Mr. Thorne?" David, still reeling, could only stammer, "It's a pool removal. She's—" The truth hung in the dusty summer air, thicker and heavier than the pulverized concrete. Karen Albright's phone lay abandoned on the pristine curb, its screen blinking futilely, a casualty of the sudden, devastating weight of David Thorne's grief. Sergeant Reynolds, the weary veteran officer, stood motionless, his gaze fixed not on the shattered pool, but on the exhausted, broken man before him. The younger officer, her name tag reading Lopez, shifted her weight, her hand hovering near her radio, unsure whether to call for a chaplain or a crime unit. David felt the immediate, catastrophic relief of having spoken the secret aloud, followed instantly by the icy terror of its consequence. He had used his son's tragedy as a shield against a busybody neighbor, but in doing so, he had handed the authorities an entirely different and far more serious legal nightmare. Sergeant Reynolds finally moved, pulling his attention away from the dark patch of soil. He walked toward David, his boots crunching on the fiberglass shards. "Mr. Thorne," Reynolds said, his voice dropping from the public administrative tone to something low and firm. "We need to talk privately and immediately. Officer Lopez, please secure the perimeter and keep the neighbor where she is." Karen, finding her voice, gasped, "Sergeant, wait! I apologize. I had no—" "Ma'am," Lopez interrupted, stepping between Karen and the developing scene. "You reported a burial. The department is now handling it. Please remain here." Reynolds guided David past the shattered pool and toward the comparative quiet of the front porch. David sank onto the steps, his body trembling, the sweat cooling on his skin instantly turning to a chilling clamminess. "You need to be very clear with me." "David," Reynolds started, crouching down so their eyes were level. "This is no longer about zoning permits. I understand you've endured an immense loss, but the act you've described, burying a body, even that of a child, on private, non-cemetery property, is a critical legal matter. We have to address this as an unauthorized burial, possibly even a concealed death, until we verify every detail. I need you to tell me everything. Start with the child's name and the official cause of death." "His name was Sam," David whispered, leaning forward, resting his head in his hands. "Samuel Robert Thorne. He was stillborn. Last August. Exactly 11 months ago. There was a complication late in the term. The doctors. They confirmed it at the hospital, St. Jude's. Do you have a death certificate, Mr. Thorne? Or a certificate of stillbirth?" "Yes," David said, lifting his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "My wife Sarah handled the paperwork, but we refused to sign the cremation forms. We couldn't. After everything. After building this whole life, the pool, the nursery for him, we couldn't just turn him into ash and put him on a shelf. And your wife Sarah, is she here now?" The question was another physical blow. David looked around the empty, dusty yard. She's not. She left 3 months ago. The grief, the quiet of the house, it destroyed her. She couldn't stay here, not with the empty nursery in the backyard where he was supposed to learn to swim. She said she was being haunted. Reynolds absorbed this, his face impassive but his eyes calculating the massive hole in the story. "So Sarah handled the paperwork. Where is the body supposed to be according to the official records? Did you inform the funeral home the burial was here?" David shook his head violently. "No, no one knows. We told the funeral home we were arranging a private internment on family land upstate. It was a lie. We brought him home. Sarah. She just wanted him close. She was falling apart. It was her idea. She said she couldn't stand the thought of him being anywhere cold, formal, or far away." He looked back at the excavation pit, the trench where the soil was exposed. The pool was the only place deep enough and the only place that felt ours. We dug it ourselves that night. We wrapped him in his blanket, put him in a cedar box, and buried him 3 feet below where the pool's foundation was going to be poured. Then we poured the concrete. It was our secret. The confession hung heavy. Reynolds sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Mr. Thorne, I understand this was an act of profound, desperate love and grief, but it's also highly illegal. It obstructs the medical examiner's records, violates health codes, and constitutes criminal concealment of a human remains disposal method. I have to call this in. He pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Reynolds, 19 Alpha. Requesting immediate contact with Detective Harris and the medical examiner's office. We have a confirmed unauthorized burial at 144 Hawthorne Ridge. Remains are reportedly a stillborn child. Hold all perimeter personnel. This is sensitive. We need to secure the scene for forensic documentation. David closed his eyes. Hearing the official language turn his son's resting place into a scene and his tragic choice into a case. Karen, watching from the curb, finally understood the true scale of the disaster she had unleashed. Her face was no longer a mask of indignation. It was pale, drawn, and riddled with genuine horror. She took a step toward David, her hand outstretched. David, please. I am so sorry. I never— shut up, Karen, David said, his voice flat, exhausted, and devoid of heat. It was a command that carried more weight than any shout. You didn't see a violation. You saw an opportunity to tear down a man you already hated. And now, because you couldn't resist that, you've forced strangers to dig up my son. Leo, the crew foreman, walked over, his face grim. He knelt beside David and put a hand on his shoulder. Patron, we pack up now, we wait. We support you. His loyalty was a small, steady anchor in the swirling chaos. Within 15 minutes, the quiet suburban street was choked with official vehicles. An unmarked black sedan, a van with the county seal, and another cruiser idled near the curb. Detective Harris, a tall, efficient woman in a sharp suit, surveyed the scene with cold, professional detachment. She listened to Reynolds' briefing, her eyes scanning the debris, the house, and finally settling on David. She walked over, cutting right to the core of the problem. Mr. Thorne, I appreciate your honesty. However, we have an obligation to verify the contents of the burial and ensure no other circumstances were involved. We have the medical examiner en route. We will need to cordon off the area and exhume the remains. David felt the last vestiges of his control snap. No, you can't. He's at peace there. It was just him. There was no crime, Detective, just 2 grieving parents who broke the law because the law offered them a sterile, cold alternative to keeping their child close. You will not dig him up. Harris was unmoved. Mr. Thorne, we are legally required to confirm the identity and the cause of death was natural as per your statement. We are securing the scene now. If you resist, we will secure you as well. I suggest you call a lawyer and tell him exactly what you told the sergeant. David watched as 2 crime scene technicians began stringing yellow tape directly across the trench, over the very patch of earth he had fought so hard to conceal. He looked up the street. Karen was being interviewed by Officer Lopez, her arms crossed, tears now streaming down her face, but David felt no sympathy. Her grief was performative. His was about to be violated. Detective Harris returned to David, her tone softened slightly by a grim professionalism. We will proceed carefully, Mr. Thorne. We expect to begin the exhumation at first light tomorrow. Until then, the property is secured and you are not permitted near the site. David stood up, numb. He glanced at the pit, now a floodlit stage for his deepest private horror. He was being shut out of his own grief. He turned away from the destruction and stumbled towards the empty, echoing silence of his house. As he reached the front door, he heard Sergeant Reynolds call out to Detective Harris, his voice low but audible across the lawn. Detective, the neighbor Karen Albright, she insists that David didn't just bury his son there. She's claiming he was digging something else up when he destroyed the pool, something related to why the pool was suddenly too expensive to keep. She says the custom depth was just a cover for another prior secret he installed 3 years ago. David froze with his hand on the doorknob. The claim was wild, illogical, and utterly Karen. But what David was actually hiding under the pool, the original, financial secret that Sarah and he had needed the deep foundation to cover up, was far worse than a tragic burial. The irony hit him like a physical wave. Karen's malicious random suspicion was finally, accidentally, about to uncover the truth David had actually been desperate to keep buried. The sun was a searing, indifferent eye in the sky by 7:30 a.m. David stood rigid inside the glass-paneled sunroom, watching the desecration of his grief unfold in his own backyard. The perimeter was now a fortress of yellow tape and official vehicles. Beyond the curb, a small crowd had gathered. Not neighbors, but local reporters and curiosity seekers, their cameras trained on the house. David had called a lawyer, a weary public defender who specialized in sensitive misdemeanor cases, who had advised him to say nothing more and cooperate entirely. Cooperation, David knew, meant standing aside while his world was torn open. Detective Harris was overseeing the operation. She wore a grim expression and practical work gloves, directing 2 forensic specialists and the medical examiner's crew. The focus was narrow, clinical, and precise. The work crew carefully peeled back the shattered fiberglass and concrete remnants, exposing the tightly packed soil. Karen Albright was nowhere in sight, having retreated into the deep defensive silence of her own home, though the drawn blinds of her upstairs window were clearly directed at the scene. The digging was painstakingly slow. The technicians started with specialized shovels, then switched to trowels and brushes, excavating the trench where David had indicated the burial took place. The silence among the workers was broken only by the scrape of metal on clay and the quiet. Technical commands from Detective Harris. At 9:18 a.m., one of the forensic specialists, a young woman named Maya, stopped. "Detective?" she called out, her voice low. "I have wood." David flinched, gripping the cool glass of the sunroom window until his knuckles turned white. After 11 months, the cedar box, the last physical act of love he and Sarah had performed for their son, was about to see the light. Detective Harris moved swiftly, kneeling at the edge of the pit. They gently cleared the earth, revealing the small, water-stained cedar box. It was carefully wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting to protect the contents from moisture, an extra measure David and Sarah had taken that desperate night. "Confirmed," Harris stated into her radio, her voice neutral. "We have the container. Proceeding with preservation and removal protocols." She looked up, her gaze meeting David's across the 100 feet of lawn. For a fleeting second, the professional mask slipped, revealing a flicker of raw human pity. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of confirmation before turning her attention back to the grim task. The box was lifted out and taken to the back of the ME's van. David closed his eyes, tears finally, silently, spilling down his cheeks. The first secret was exposed. Sam was found. But the work didn't stop. As the ME's team took custody of the remains, Detective Harris approached Sergeant Reynolds, who was supervising the core excavation of the main pool pit. "Harris," Reynolds said, looking stressed, "the base is weird here. Thorne said it was a custom deep end, but the amount of rebar and the depth of the initial concrete pour is excessive. It's like they were building a bunker, not a pool." Harris stepped into the pit, looking closely at the thick, original concrete slab that had formed the true base of the pool basin, several feet below where Sam's cedar box had been placed. "He confessed to the burial of the child?" "That case is solid, misdemeanor charge, likely sympathetic sentencing. But the neighbor, Karen, she kept insisting this was a cover for an older secret. She claimed the expensive custom depth was the secret, that he was trying to hide something large beneath the foundation when it was originally poured 3 years ago." Reynolds frowned. "Karen's unhinged, but she was right about the burial." "Exactly," Harris said, her eyes now focused on a spot near the center of the pit. "And look here. The foundation concrete is uniform until this specific point. It looks like a seam, like a patch." She pointed to an area where the concrete mix looked slightly newer, the color subtly different, and the edge suspiciously straight. She called over the foreman of David's original demolition crew. "Leo, when you were breaking this up, did you notice anything unusual about the bottom slab?" Leo, whose grim loyalty to David was still palpable, hesitated. Patron wanted it deep. He said it was for a special foundation, stronger. "But I remember that patch, Detective. We broke the concrete here. He stamped his foot on the seam Harris had indicated. It was thicker, but after we chipped through it, there was a metal plate underneath. We just poured the new concrete over the plate to finish the base. Patron paid us extra to keep quiet about it. David, still watching from the sunroom, saw the three figures in the pit suddenly snap to attention, their eyes fixed on the patched area. Leo. David cursed silently. He had paid Leo handsomely 3 years ago to forget that day. Detective Harris's face hardened, the look of pity replaced by the cold, exhilarating focus of a lead detective on a hot scent. Get a ground-penetrating radar unit out here now. I want to see what's under that plate. Reynolds, expand the perimeter tape and call the prosecutor's office. This is no longer a misdemeanor. Within minutes, the work intensified. The forensic technicians were back, this time with heavy, mechanized, diamond-tipped cutting saws. The air filled with the screech of grinding concrete and the smell of ozone. David watched in helpless despair as they surgically cut out a clean, rectangular section of the pool's central foundation. The patch came loose with a final, heavy crack. Beneath it lay a thick, circular plate of dark marine-grade steel, nearly 4 feet in diameter, secured by 6 massive industrial-grade bolts. It was a high-security access hatch, perfectly concealed and designed to withstand submersion and extreme pressure. David stumbled back from the window, pressing his hands over his face. This was it. Karen hadn't just accidentally ruined his life with the burial. Her malice had accidentally exposed the one unforgivable act he had committed. Detective Harris crouched down, examining the bolts. This wasn't meant to be found. Get the acetylene torch and the impact wrench. We are going in. The heavy hiss and blue flame of the torch tore through the morning silence, a brutal, invasive sound of imminent exposure. It took nearly an hour to melt and cut the hardened steel bolts. David watched, sickened, as the men used a mechanical hoist to winch the massive steel hatch free. When the plate lifted, it revealed not dirt but the mouth of a narrow, reinforced concrete shaft descending into a space of absolute darkness. A rush of cold, stagnant air that hadn't seen the surface in 3 years, vented into the pit, carrying with it a faint metallic odor. Harris, shining a tactical light down the shaft, did not hesitate. It's a vault. Get me a camera on a boom and a breaching unit. And for God's sake, put the media on notice. We have a situation. The camera was lowered. David watched the technicians monitor through the sunroom window. The picture was grainy but clear enough. At the bottom of the 7-foot concrete shaft was a small, high-security room, a dry, climate-controlled vault. Inside, neatly stacked on a steel shelf, were multiple high-capacity encrypted hard drives bound together with heavy-duty zip ties. Next to them was a meticulously organized, leather-bound ledger book, its cover debossed with the stylized logo of Archon Global Securities. David recognized the logo instantly. It was the name of the Cayman Islands hedge fund he had been forcibly removed from 3 years ago, just before the pool installation. The name of the company he was forbidden, under a legally binding multi-million-dollar NDA, from ever speaking about again. The records in that box represented not just his financial ruin, but a massive international financial fraud investigation the FBI had dropped just short of indictment due to lack of hard evidence. Detective Harris looked up from the pit, her eyes now gleaming with the triumph of a major case cracked wide open. She didn't look at David. She looked at the vault. "Reynolds," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. The original pool was installed to hide the entrance to a financial vault containing evidence of systemic fraud. The child was buried on top of the crime scene. Contact the FBI field office now. Tell them we found the Archon ledgers. David staggered away from the window. The image of the Archon logo and the stacked hard drives burned behind his eyelids. The small, heartbreaking lie he told to keep his son close had failed, and in its failure it had exposed the enormous, life-destroying crime he had spent 3 years burying. The police hadn't come for the son, but they were now staying for the father. The transition from a quiet suburban police investigation into a full-blown federal operation was brutal and immediate. Before noon, the white county vans were replaced by the sleek black SUVs of the FBI, their tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights of the remaining patrol cars. David, now officially a person of extreme interest in an international fraud case, was transported from his sunroom, past the throng of photographers, and into the sterile confines of the municipal precinct for formal questioning. He was in an uncomfortable, windowless interrogation room with a cheap metal table. Opposite him sat not Detective Harris, but a man named Agent Sterling, sharp, immaculately dressed, and exuding the chilling patience of someone who knew exactly how much trouble David was in. "Mr. Thorne, let's get this sorted out quickly," Sterling began, pushing the large, leather-bound Archon Global Securities ledger across the table. The embossed logo seemed to mock David. "The documents in that vault, the hard drives, the ledgers, they pertain to the collapse of Archon 3 years ago. The $800 million disappeared, the SEC files went blank, and the key players, including yourself, walked away with severance packages and ironclad NDAs. We believe this vault contains the original data, the actual, verifiable evidence of wire fraud, insider trading, and money laundering that we could never pin down. Is that correct?" David's lawyer, a tired man named Mr. Chen, leaned forward. "My client is prepared to confirm that those documents are related to his former employment at Archon Global. Anything further requires transactional immunity." Sterling laughed, a short, dry, unpleasant sound. "Immunity? Mr. Thorne, you didn't just fail to report a crime. You built a concrete vault, a high-security container beneath a swimming pool to conceal evidence of a federal crime that cost thousands of people their retirement. You then buried your son on top of the vault. We are talking about conspiracy, evidence tampering, and desecration of remains, among other things. We're offering a plea deal, not a pardon." "Start talking!" The pressure was immense. David felt the sheer weight of his past crashing down on the delicate, tragic secret of his son. He looked at the ledger, remembering the dizzying months of panic 3 years prior, when the entire structure of Archon was crumbling and he, the chief strategist, had realized he was holding the bag. "I didn't steal the money," David said, his voice husky. "I was an accomplice to the cover-up. I found the backdoor ledgers, the ones that proved my boss, Maxwell Trent, was the architect of the fraud. I was fired, but before I left, I copied everything, intending to use it as leverage to save my reputation, maybe even start a new life. I dug the vault and sealed the evidence before the internal audit began. The pool was just camouflage." "So, you admit to concealing the evidence?" Agent Sterling pressed. "The hard drives are encrypted. Do you have the access keys?" David shook his head, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. "No, I lost the note a year ago. It was on a flash drive, but it disappeared when the house was chaotic." Sterling's patience evaporated. "You lost the keys to $800 million worth of evidence? That's convenient. We'll find them. We always do." At that moment, the door opened. Detective Harris stood in the doorway, her expression serious. "Agent Sterling, we have a situation. A woman just showed up at the Thorne residence demanding access to the scene. She's his wife, Sarah Thorne. She's demanding to speak with David, claiming she has vital information regarding the contents of the vault." David's heart hammered against his ribs. Sarah. After 3 months of painful silence and separation, she was back, drawn by the public explosion of their secrets. "Bring her here," Sterling commanded instantly. "Mr. Thorne, you're about to have a reunion. Let's see how well your stories match up." 15 agonizing minutes later, Sarah Thorne was ushered into the room. She looked utterly unlike the ghost who had left 3 months ago. Her grief was still etched on her face, but it was mixed now with a hardened, fierce resolve. She didn't look at Sterling or Chen. Her eyes, wild with sorrow and anger, were locked on David. "You brought the police to Sam," she accused, her voice trembling but sharp. "You chose a zoning dispute over our promise. They dug him up, David. They dug up our son. They were going to find the vault anyway, Sarah," David pleaded. Karen forced their hand. "I tried to cover the burial site by destroying the pool." "Quiet!" Agent Sterling interjected, slamming his hand on the table. "I don't care about your marital spat. Mrs. Thorne, you said you have vital information. Does that pertain to the Archon documents?" Sarah took a deep breath, turning her focus onto the agent. Her anger seemed to steady her. It does. I handled the cremation lie, the funeral home, the certificates, but I also helped David seal the vault. I knew about the records, and I knew what they meant. The hard drives are useless without the correct cipher, and that cipher is tied to an activation file. David stared at her, stunned. You never told me you knew about the cipher. I thought I lost the note. Sarah ignored him. The key isn't a password, agent. The key is an activation file. David was paranoid that Archon's lawyers might track the data if he ever tried to access it remotely. The decryption only works if two unique files are merged on an external unsecured drive, a kind of dead man switch. One file was on the flash drive he kept. The other has to be physically present to merge. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes shining with intense interest. And where is that physical file, Mrs. Thorne? Sarah reached into her worn leather bag and produced a simple silver locket, a piece David had given her years ago. It had always held a tiny folded photo of their ultrasound. She unclasped it and flipped it over. Engraved on the back of the silver casing were 2 lines of extremely small, precise alphanumeric characters. This is the physical key, she stated, holding it up. When I left 3 months ago, I didn't leave because I was haunted. I left because I realized David was never going to confess, and I couldn't live in a house built on a grave and a crime vault. I took the physical key. I needed to control the narrative. The contents of that vault don't just clear David. They implicate half the major players on Wall Street. And the hard drives will stay encrypted until I know my son's unauthorized burial isn't just a political footnote in a major financial case. She stared at Agent Sterling, the power dynamic in the room swinging wildly in her favor. My son's remains were dug up because your investigation was manipulated by a furious, nosy neighbor. I want guaranteed full immunity for David on the burial and the fraud conspiracy, and a written agreement from the city that they will facilitate and pay for an official, legal reinterment of Sam with proper monumentation within the next 48 hours. Then, and only then, you get the key. David, watching the transformation of his grieving wife into a stone-cold negotiator, felt a bizarre mix of terror and pride. Karen's petty malice had brought down a giant, but Sarah had just stepped in to leverage their collective tragedy into an act of karmic justice. She had the power. End of Part 4. Emotional Stakes. Power Shift. Part 4 introduces Sarah as a critical player, not just a victim, and establishes the high-stakes negotiation. She holds the key to the federal case and uses her family's tragedy to demand justice, not for the crime, but for the son. This sets up the climax in Part 5, the negotiation, the confession, and the final fate of David, Sarah, and Karen. Let me know if you would like Part 5 to conclude the story.